Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving holiday and the week is going well for you. Welcome to this edition of our CME series, Stories of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And this is an activity that's put on by the DE&I Working Group of the COCPA. We've had a number of stories of CPAs with different backgrounds, talking about their experiences, the life lessons that they've learned, and things that we can all use in our own careers and our own lives. And we're very fortunate today to have Cliff Linhart. Cliff is a CPA. He's worked in public accounting as well as private industry. And his unique background is that he's been in the Naval Reserve. And so having worked with Cliff, I've always been really impressed with how he's been able to balance, being a high performer at work, his responsibilities in the Naval Reserve, and still having a strong family life. And I think he's going to have some great lessons for the rest of us. And I don't want to take too much of his time because he's got a lot to share with us, and I know you're all going to really enjoy it. So Cliff, I'll let you maybe give a little more detailed introduction on your background and your message. So take it away, and I'll mute myself in case the dogs start barking again.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Once again, my name is Cliff Linhart. I'm currently the Chief Accounting Officer for Funded Resources, which is an oil and gas company here in Denver. I'm a board member for the Marion Downs Center for Hearing and Speech, and I'm a commander in the Navy Reserves. And I have served both as enlisted and commissioned officer with the military since 1991. I first started out in the Marine Corps Reserves and then switched over to the Navy Reserves, which is a little bit unusual, and then picked up my commission in the Navy. And so let me kind of give you my background. I grew up in Lakewood, Colorado, so I'm a native, which is pretty rare. I have an identical twin brother, which is important to note because I think he always gets me into trouble. And so I'll explain that in a little bit. Me and my brother were both interested in our senior year in high school to join the military. And he went ahead and joined the Marine Corps Reserves active duty. I wasn't quite sure I wanted to do the active duty part. So I said, well, I'm going to go to Fort Lewis College for a year. And during that first semester, I decided I'm going to join the Marine Corps Reserves. Might have not been the smartest thing I've ever done, but it was a great experience. So as you can imagine, the reason why I say this, I was never an athlete in high school. And here I'm joining the Marine Corps, having to learn how to run 3 miles, do pull-ups, do all the physical aspects. And I'm thinking, this probably wasn't the smartest way to go. But the one thing I learned from that is that you can persevere through anything and you can get that job done. And it really set me up for what I would say capable to do later on. So after going through boot camp, which by the way, I would suggest never break your foot. So that's another thing I did. So you can imagine I spent, Marine Corps boot camp is 3 months. I spent an extra 6 weeks. So that in itself was a perseverance test right there. So, but I would all in all say it was a great experience in the fact that you learn so much. What it means to be, what you can actually do. From there, I went through Marine Corps Logistics School in Barstow, California, and I came back in March of 1992 and went back to Fort Lewis College in the fall while participating in the Marine Corps Reserves. And then from there, I graduated in 1995 from Fort Lewis College, and I really was trying to find myself because I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Finance, but I really wasn't finding a job that really fit that finance part at that time. So I decided to go back to school to get my master's degree in accounting. So, and at that time, I met a Navy officer recruiter and discussed about maybe becoming a logistical supply officer. And of course, I went ahead and presented to my wife, and she said flatly no. And so, and I listened. And so, but my brother, once again, when I was talking to him, this is where he gets me into trouble, is that he had joined the Navy Reserves. He had completed his active duty tour. A recruiter approached him and said the Navy had a reserve officer program that was a direct commissioning program for enlisted. And so he had joined up and started that program. And then he went and talked to me about the program, and I was interested in becoming an officer. And at that point, I went ahead and talked to the recruiter, talked to my wife. I think it's a fair compromise at that time. And so I joined the Navy Reserves, and I started doing that in 1998. And so that was a big year because that's when also my first child was born. So as we go along in our career paths, we always have interesting things occur to us. So in 1999, I had to go to learn my school for my designator. And of course, being the Navy at that time and being, not really thoughtful on when Mother's Day occurred, I flew out on my wife's first Mother's Day. So I've been living with that ever since, but that's just the life of being in the Navy. And so, which I will have to say, my wife is very gracious and very supportive of my being in the Navy Reserves. And so I think, that's part of that being my success is due to my wife and my family. And so I want to make sure I say that. In 2001, I was selected as Blue Jacket of the Year in the Navy for my designator. And through that and being a high performer, I was selected in February of 2001 as an officer, which was another big year for me because at that time I was selected as a commissioned officer, started out as an ensign in the Navy, then graduated with my master's degree in accounting, started public accounting in a small firm, and then 9/11 occurred. And you can imagine what that was like, because no one knew what we were going to do. And, we didn't know what the response was going to be. We were trying to all figure that out. And there's 1 month where I sat there and I literally was in the process of taking the CPA exam. I just stopped studying because I didn't know I was going to be recalled. I didn't know what we were going to do. And so, all this anxiety. And after a month, I decided I better start studying since I only have a month left. And so the nice part is I passed. Somehow I passed, but to me, that was amazing because here I took a break and we were ready to go to war, but we didn't know who we were going to war with. And you just didn't know what the outcome of that future. So I say that's probably my biggest year. And going from there to 2004, I switched over to Heinen Associates, and from my local firm, and I was a lieutenant then. And so at that time, I had gone through all my schooling and started learning what it meant to be an officer, which is quite different from being enlisted. As enlisted, you're kind of more of you do the work, eventually go into mid-level management. In the Navy, officers they're running the show. So when you first start out, you learn what your job is supposed to be doing. Then you start going to management, and then you go into upper management. And so, I started correlating what I learned in the Navy to what it meant to be in public accounting, from being a senior accountant to supervisor to a manager. It was great to kind of compare the two as you've gone along, because you understand how to motivate people, what works, what doesn't work, what's your environment, what's their perspective. And I think that's the key of the success I had in public accounting and in private, is really taking what I've learned. And going a little bit further, in 2008, my second child was born, or my third child was born. And in 2009, I was selected for lieutenant commander, which is a big deal in the Navy, because that means you can make retirement in the reserves. So usually if you're a lieutenant, you high your tenure out at maybe 12 years. As a lieutenant commander, you can do the full 20 to get your retirement. And that's usually the cutoff of when they start making those decisions, who's going to proceed forward. And I was lucky to go ahead and be selected. And I was also lucky to be selected for a mobilization to Afghanistan. I say that, but it was a great experience. I went over and backing up, I went and was mobilized in May of 2009. I went through my training to go overseas. I went to my supporting command where they trained me on the job that I was supposed to do. And then in August, flew into Afghanistan, which I would say the entire process was very enlightening of what we're capable of doing and what we had to do for the mission set. And then actually being in country from 2009 to 2010, May of 2010. I mean, it was a great experience, but also a really tough experience for me and my family. I would say, I had a 1-year-old that I pretty much missed the entire year. And so my story is perseverance that's tough. So, but at the same time, high level, I was able to perform on a high level and came back, and I've had a significant success after that mobilization. I've had an extreme amount of fun being at department heads. So I did 3 department head tours, which in the Navy is a big deal. And in the reserves, your department head tours running operations. So you're running what the unit's doing on an operational side, running an administrative side. It's really learning what it takes to make sure people are getting their evals, fit reps. And then lastly is the training. That was in itself, getting people trained up to do their job is one of the most important parts in the Navy, being a CO. And I'll reiterate that a little bit later, but learning that process really led me to become an executive officer when I got promoted to commander in 2016. And that correlates to my success as an executive officer, learning how to use those skills to become a chief accounting officer at Fifth Creek Resource, which was eventually sold in 2018. And then my continual career. And so I've had some really good mentors that I would say when I was an executive officer, 2 captains who really took me under the wing and really led to me what it meant to be a commanding officer. So part of the process that I learned being those department heads, which is not being the administrative officer, is not the funnest job in the world. You're doing a lot of paperwork. I mean, I'd rather do financial statements than to do evals and fit reps and have to write things up. But I would say that it creates that basis so that when you become a commanding officer, you know what is right and wrong, what you have to do to get people promoted, how you have to communicate to your supporting command, and how you deal with the Navy Reserves itself. And so that led me to become, even being pushed out of my comfort zone to becoming a commanding officer. And so I took my first tour in 2019, in December of 2019. Well, in March of 2020, I was trying to figure out what to do in COVID, because now we're shut down. Now we had to make risk assessments. What can we do? Some commands decided that they were not going to endanger their people. Other people were going to say, we're going to take some risk. So what's the right and wrong answer? And then how do you keep people, keep their readiness up? Because the whole idea in the reserves is to deploy. And so I have to make sure people are trained to do their job. And so that was a very interesting experience. We learned a lot in my command, my first year, in that what works and doesn't work. And I think a lot of employers found out what works and doesn't work, right? You know, it's one of those, how do you adapt to the point and be flexible to achieve what you need to achieve? And so, you know, one of the things I always said was that the Marines have is Semper Gumby, which means always flexible. And so you just have to be flexible on the situation. You can't be rigid. You just have to adapt and overcome on those items. So I had a very successful first tour, and now I'm on my second tour, and taking a unit up on the West Coast that I actually fly out to. So it's the first time I actually been flying out to my units, and which leads me into that time management piece. You have so much demands. You really have to learn how to do that time management and trying to adapt what works and what doesn't work. And now that I've been fortunate to be most of my career in Denver, but now I'm flying out to the West Coast. And I sit there and I'm like, okay, now I have to make sure I have lodging when I show up. And I have to make sure I get my get a plane ticket. I get a rental car. You know, those are little things that you have to adapt to. And I think understanding that piece of that time management is important. Plus, I have two careers. If you think about it, I have my chief accounting officer career. I have to keep relevant and do all the things I need to do. Now I have a commanding officer tour, which means I have people reporting to me, and I have to make those decisions, and I have to make sure that they're getting trained up and that everything's proceeding there. And then I have my family, and that's the hard part, because you don't want to ever shortchange your family. But I do miss a significant amount of events, and my family is fortunate. You know, I'm fortunate that my family supports me on that. But there are times that I miss quite a bit of my family's activities, because I'm either on a drill weekend, I'm either doing my 2 weeks that I have to do every year. There's commitments that I have to do at work. And so trying to juggle what's important, what's not important. I mean, really that takes a lot of time. And that's the thing I tell people, is that you really have to juggle that. And you have to get a handle of how are you going to keep that high performance while doing all these things and being in contact with your family, because that's your most important thing in the world. So on that, I would say for time management, that's one of the things I learned being in the Navy Reserves. Moreover, is the time management piece. The next
Hey,
thing
Cliff.
I learned, yeah.
Cliff, can I interrupt you and just ask a question while you're on that?
Sure.
And by the way, for everyone else, if you have questions that you want to put in the chat, either now or when we finish, I neglected to tell you that up front. Please do that, and I'll read them, and we'll have time for live Q&A at the end too. But I just, as you're talking about that commitment, I think there is maybe a perception for those of us in civilian life that if you're in the reserves, you're in the reserves waiting to get called up. And it's a pretty significant time commitment, having observed you. Could you just like put a little more specifics on that so people really understand? Like, How many days a year or weeks a year? Because I think it's a lot more than the rest of us really know.
That's a great question, Jim. I really appreciate that. And to kind of give you the background. So in the reserves, we're required to do 28 days of drill weekend. So when you think about it, when I go to my units, I want to get to touch them and talk to them for 28 days. And then there's 2 weeks out of the year that I'm either with the unit or I'm at some sort of training or I'm doing something with the supporting command. But what Jim's talking about, it's a lot more than that, because really it's taking care of your people. So we like to try and make sure that we recognize people with awards. We have to make sure that they're going to get promoted with their fit reps and evals, because evals and fit reps in the Navy are important, because that's how we judge who our high performers are and our people who are not. And so to get promoted, we want to make sure that we're hitting all those wickets for them and that they're being competitive. They compete against all the other enlisted. And so, or if you're enlisted, for example, if you're an E6, you're going to compete against all the other E6s. If you're an officer, you compete against all the lieutenants. And so we want to make sure we recognize and write that so they get promoted. And so what I have found that is I spend maybe about 1 to 2 hours a day on the Navy Reserves as a commanding officer. And that's time I don't get paid. That's what we call patriot time. And it's there because I want to make sure my people are being taken care of, that I'm taking care of their issues, because my most important item is that I want to make sure that I'm taking that time so they can spend time doing with their families and with their work, and that we're taking care of them. But that doesn't extend it just to me. That includes my executive officer. That includes my senior enlisted leader. And I have to say, my senior enlisted leaders are constantly working. And their dedication to the Navy always amazes me, because they're looking at trying to make sure that their enlisted sailors are being taken care of. And they spend an enormous amount of time taking care of it. So it's just not a commitment of 1 week in a month. That's just the recruiting commercials, right? It's really more than that, because really at the end of the day, I want to make sure my people get taken care of, that they're getting promoted, that we're resolving those problems. So hopefully, please let me know if there's anything else on that I need to expand upon, but it's quite a bit of work. And so, but you have to, it's what I do really enjoy it. And I do really like to help people, and because I'm near the tail end of my career. So I'm really trying to help out my junior officers, my enlisted, so they can take my place when the time comes, and to help them out, because it's a very rewarding and fulfilling job. And please ask any questions. Part of this is I don't want to talk about just myself. I do want to answer any questions that come up throughout the presentation.
Yeah, so maybe I'll go ahead with what we have right now from Bob. Bob has a comment. I totally agree with Cliff regarding the benefit of military service. I spent 3 years as a U.S. Army officer, including the Vietnam War. Best experience in my life, especially learning how to be a leader. Encourage your kids to spend 3 years in the military. Thanks, Bob, and thanks for your service. Mary has a question. Curious about what positives and negatives you've experienced when someone learns you're in the Navy Reserves, have been to Afghanistan, and continue to serve in the military.
So I would say that the positives, everyone's always interested in saying, hey, what did I do in the reserves, or what I can talk about certain aspects, right? So, and it's always fun because people don't realize what the capability of the Navy is, between, talking with people about what our carriers are capable of on an unclassified level, of course, but, and what what programs there are. Like I've done a lot of speaking about talking to friends or people that come up to me about Space Com or Space Command, and people just don't understand it. And it's really interesting to see why we talk about Space Command, why we reinstituted Space Command, and then what's Space Force. That's another confusing aspect. So and those are things that are interesting to me, and I like to talk to people. So it's very positive to kind of spread what the Navy does. And also, I also like the fact that the Navy really cares about its people. We want to make sure that we take care of them, and we're always looking out for their mental health. And to me, that's probably one of the most important things, is that if we have a sailor who's struggling, we will find them the help. And that to me is outstanding of what the character of the Navy is about, the commander has. Because if someone gets hurt or someone's just, thoughts of suicide, we'll find them the help that they need. So to me, that's great. The negative aspects, I'll just say this in all the years I've been in, sometimes the negative aspects is when we were fully engaged in Afghanistan, Iraq, people were wondering, well, if you're applying for a new job, are you they're not supposed to discriminate, but there's always that underlying question of when they ask, well, how long you're going to be here? What if you get mobbed? Things of that nature. And I think that's where the negativity comes from. So overall, to me, I always like to look at the positives aspects of it. I enjoy the learning aspect. I enjoy the camaraderie. And right now it's really just, I enjoy the people, working with the people. That's what keeps me going at this point.
Yeah, it's that way in so much in life, right? Looking at the positives.
Right.
Rebecca has a comment. I like the comments of prioritizing what's important. Obviously, only way you could get through this, but I think something that's critical for all of us in our careers and our lives. So after that interruption, I'll let you go on with your lessons learned, and we'll continue to ask questions, people.
That's great. It's a good lead on to my next topic, is really taking care of people. My number one priority as a commanding officer is take care of my people. And part of that is get to know your people. I can't know everyone, but I can know enough. And then I can lead by that example to get other people to engage with their people. And so we get to know what's going on with them. We can understand what their problems and issues are. I mean, I recently had a sailor who spent 2 years trying to figure out one issue that on his clearance that he was trying to resolve. And then once I found out about it, I just made 2 phone calls and took care of it. And so to me, it was like, well, why didn't anyone help him out before? But I was able to help him out because I understood what his problem was. I understood what he was trying to do. And that's an example of getting to know your people and presenting that you actually care for them, trying to resolve those issues. Because at the end of the day, they're going to be doing the work. Well, as a commanding officer, I hate to say this, I do most of the administrative because I'm there to take care of them and to project a vision and get the mission done. They're the ones that's going to actually do the work, my junior officers and sailors. And so I want to make sure that they're functioning at a high level. And that's why, to me, really taking care of your people and understanding their problems and making sure that you're taking care of their needs, especially when it comes to promotions. That's why when I talked about evals and fit reps, that's the most important documentation I can give to my officers and my enlisted, because that's what's going to get them promoted. And I know that some COs will go and they'll take whatever's in front of them and sign the evaluation. I won't do that because I want to make sure these people are on track and that they get promoted. The third thing I wanted to talk about is mentorship and training. Look, to me, mentorship is the most important thing you can do as a leader. And this is one of those things I learned, is that you want to take people under your wing. You want to mentor them to make those decisions. And the first part of that is by leading by example, right? When I talked about taking care of your people, that's leading by example. That mentorship, you want to lead by example, that you're mentoring people underneath your command or even above. You don't always have to be in command, but you can be that mentor that's there and you can represent so that the organization understands. Because me as the commanding officer, I set the tone. I really do. If I come in and if I'm not happy, well, guess what? The unit's not going to be happy. But if I'm happy helping them, trying to make it a great learning environment, people enjoy that. Morale goes up. And so you set the tone. But also the other thing is always ask for perspective on issues and problems from other people. I think I see this where people make quick decisions, but they didn't really understand what the problem is. And that's part of that mentorship I talked about. You really want to get their perspective on that issue and have them tell you what their decision would be. Because that's a great way of going through what's your thought process and when you make a decision. You get to learn what they're trying to do. Some people are very quick on a decision. Other people have a tendency to not make a decision because they want to make it the perfect decision. Being a CO of a reserve unit, I'm not there to make the perfect solution. I'm there to make sure I get a solution out to help people. And that's helped me on my job. And that's kind of what I follow is the OODA loop concept. And it was developed by the Air Force. And it's a very quick way to make a decision, which is observe the situation, you orientate to the problem, you make a decision, and then you act. And then you repeat that loop. And it was developed so that warfighters can make a decision, because the sooner that you can act against an adversary, the sooner that that adversary has to keep going back to the same OODA loop that you do, but you're disorientating him in the fact that you're making decisions quicker. And so, but way I try and measure my success is to make sure I try and do, can I get an average success rate on my decisions? And I'm not saying that every decision is right. I'm just trying to make sure that we take care of our people and that we're moving process forward, because I can't get 100% solution to a problem or 100% success rate is not reality. But at the same point, I don't want to make a quick decision. So, and the last part, and one thing I learned about on the mentorship and training is, now we've talked about making decisions and having people make decisions, is the best CEOs I ever had were ones that once they made a decision, went back and explained it to everyone that they were mentoring, why they made that decision. And I think that's a tough thing, especially when you have a tough problem if you're going to separate a sailor and why you're going to separate them. There's always a quick reaction like, well, they did this. Well, okay. Or you're supporting them and say, well, we don't want to separate them. But you have to look at why the situation occurred and why it might be right to go ahead and separate that person. I saw that with one CO where he had to go in front of a separation board, and usually most CEOs will support the sailor, but this sailor had done something that said, hey, he could potentially be a senior enlisted leader, and we need to separate him because of his actions that he committed. And it's because he did not trust them after that action. And it was pretty horrendous. And so in my mind, that tell me is, well, what's the thought process that the CEO is going through? And it was a great learning experience, because there's some things we never really considered. So I encourage people to try and do that when you're with the people you're mentoring on problems. It's kind of walk them through what's your decision, and then bring up your decision. It might not be right, or it might be right, it might be wrong, but at least you're making that how you've thought your process through, and it might bring into something that you didn't think about.
Hey, Cliff, we've had a couple of requests from people asking you to go through that decision-making process again. I think a lot of us are taking notes on that.
Okay, so I'll go through the OODA loop. All right, and so this was designed. I'll go through more explanation on it, and I apologize if I go too quickly. So, but the OODA loop was designed for basically war fighters to make a 70% success rate on their decision making. And so the OODA loop stands for orientate. So I'm sorry, observe. I always reverse it. Observe. So you observe the problem and you're looking at the problem and you're seeing what the situation is. It's involving, right? So you're trying to gather all your information. And then you're orientated and you start your thought process of what that actually you're trying to achieve. You know, what does the information tell you that's going on? And then you make your decision. And that decision is based on what you observed and and through your orientation process. And then you act. And the idea is to speed up that decision-making process. And so, but the OODA loop doesn't stop at the act. You go back through and then you observe what just happened. And if it's not working, well, then you go back and you say, I'm gonna orientate again. Okay, I have more information now. Now I make my decision. Now I act. And then I go back to orientate again. And so that way you're progressing. And the idea is that the faster you can make decision, your adversary has to go through the same thought process. So if you're disrupting their OODA loop, where they might get to orientate, you've already made a decision and acted upon it, they have to go back to observe because they have to process all the new information. And the idea was to kind of speed that up because your success rate would actually start building up because the more success, the more it snowballs. So does that, let me know if that helps.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That's I appreciate that because that's something I've always thought about in business, that we're always having to make decisions with incomplete and imperfect information, and knowing when to make the decision. We usually make them too late rather than too early. So that's a really good process.
Right.
Bob, have you got a question?
So it's actually a comment. Cliff, number one, I am thrilled that you're doing this. This is so cool. Number two, as I posted, I spent 3 years as a U.S. Army officer in the Vietnam War, or 1 year in Vietnam, 2 years in other places. It was the best experience of my life, particularly in the context of leadership. Many of us are parents. I made a mistake as a parent that I really didn't encourage our 5 kids to go in the military. In fact, quite the contrary. And that was a huge mistake because the experience that you get in the military, particularly as an officer, that's experience that it's just not available anywhere else in the world. And so as your kids are getting into their teenage years and they're exploring, okay, what do I want to do in my life? I really encourage them to consider the military. That's it.
Thanks, Bob. It's, I've done the same thing with my children. My oldest had no interest in the military. My daughter wants to be in the Navy Reserve. She wants to beat my rank. So I said, good luck. And so, she's working on it. She's going to school now in the Navy ROTC. And I think it's great. I really do think it's great because now we have something to share. And, I was laughing the other day because, she first went in there and they have a gunnery sergeant who, they were training them and they're kind of like, not OCS, officer candidate school, but something where the gunny kept calling her portal and, they come up with very interesting nicknames, a lot cleaner than it was when I first went in. So I would say I was just chuckling because she was mad. He kept calling her portal. And I said, because she wears glasses. And I said, well, I think that's pretty cool because there's a lot worse things they can call you. So to me, I really do encourage the military, especially for kids who just get out of high school and they don't know what to do. I also think it's a great place, and all services. It's a great place for people to restart their lives. I met while I was going through Afghanistan training someone who loved the Army. He was a medic. He graduated with a GED. He was telling me, and he just loved the Army because they took care of him. He was able to get his high school diploma. He was able to, be successful at his job, and they were training him, and he was absorbing all those things in there. I think that's just great. I really do. I think it's a great place for people to go in and kind of figure out what they want to do. And, and I think in my mind, it's something that people should consider. So thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. All right. The last thing I was going to talk about was delegation. And I think I'll be honest. I think public accounting, when I was in public accounting, delegation is a little hard, right? Because you get in this mindset. Maybe it's for accountants, but we all think it's easier for us just to do the work than to delegate it out. And and I've struggled with that too. But my reserve unit, I really learned I have to delegate because my reserve units are somewhere between 30 to could be 130. There's some units that may be 400 plus. That's a lot you can't do all the work that needs to be done. You just have to delegate those out. That's why you have department heads. But it's a great way to get people opportunities to improve their career. That's how I train my department heads. They come in. If I have an administrative officer, they get to learn what that means. They have to go through all the evals and fit reps. They have to make sure it's written in a certain way. Yeah. Are we taking care of those people? How they're ranked? There are certain things that we don't want to do. I don't want to say this person's my number one cycle and then change and then reduce them to, lower tier unless they deserve it. But I don't want to reduce them lower tier because until maybe a rank 2 or 3, because when the board reviews it, they'll say, well, something happened here. Maybe the CO is sending a message. So those are things that I like to do is give those opportunities and mentor. Another way to mentor what it means to be, as you go up to be an XO and eventually a CO. I mentor my XO all the time because she's eventually going to become a CO and she's really good. And so I want her to understand these are the items that you have to watch out for and and get her the experience she's lacking in that she didn't have. And so I think when you think about just doing the work yourself without signing that delegation, you're really giving them no opportunities to succeed and to learn. And so I would highly encourage to think about it that way. but also set up some parameters, right? Make them responsible for certain courses of action. You know, I hold people accountable, just like you would at work with employees or a contractor. You have to hold them accountable. Yes, Bob.
I don't think you can hear me. Bennett?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. The Cliff, can you comment on the conflict? You've got 2 full-time jobs. How do you manage that in the sense of you've got to get the financials out, and you got a problem in California. How do you deal with it?
Well, yeah, probably a lack of sleep sometimes, right? I mean, I want to tell you, you know, when I first started out public accounting, you know, you're working 60 hours a week, and then I would go to drill weekend, and then I would go back home, and I would work another 8. And I'm like, and then I would get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock. Sometimes I felt like I just wanted to cry because, you know, you just went to sleep, right? And so I think, you know, it's really an art of managing. And sometimes, you know, I have to look at things like, what's the priority? And because you do get bombarded with a lot of priorities, like, oh, I need this now. Well, do you really need it now? Are you sure? Well, wait. Sometimes I just wait and see how I kind of know the progression of what happens. So I try and spread that out throughout the week. But I mean, it's tough. So trust me, every day I check my Navy email. I just pray there's not an issue I have to deal with, right? Because right then and there, because it's just one of those things like, you know, some days I win and some days I lose. So you know, it really does take a lot. So, but I would do say a little bit of lack of sleep sometimes is how that occurs. So if there's any other comments, we'll finish up on delegation. And this is the one thing I think we really need to focus on in societies that allow people to fail. So sometimes we say, hey, you're trained up, hey, you can do the job, and they make a mistake, and then you're kicked to the curb. And I think when I'm in the commands that have always been successful is we look at and we create an environment that it's okay to fail. We want people to learn from their mistakes, right? Now, there's some things that you can't have them fail, but you got to create the environment on the right situations that, hey, it's okay to fail on this. And that failure leads to results because they learn from those failures. And that's the best way to train, is you learn from your own mistakes. And so that's what part really of delegation for me is, also an opportunity to mentor and to take care of my people, because I look at them like, hey, mistakes are made. How are we going to fix this? And then you learn, well, okay, here's the rules. Here's something different than we didn't think about. I mean, to me, it's creating that environment. And so I try to do that at Fundera too, is like, hey, you know, mistakes are going to be made. We're trying new things. We try new avenues. We're trying to accrue the right amount of revenue. And I can tell you that sometimes we miss the boat, and that's okay. So because we want people to come back and achieve the results. So Jim, do you have any other?
Yeah, I'll read a couple of comments here. One from Mary. I'm guessing it's actually a compliment when you get your nickname this early in your military career. You're probably not knowing your daughter's got such a great example. I'm sure she is doing really well. And from Rebecca, I love the thought of letting people learn from their own mistakes. Yeah, hard to do, especially in public accounting, I think. So that's a good lesson.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, if you've got other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand or just speak out. I do have a question that I wanted you to touch on, Cliff, and that is thinking about you being deployed and then coming back into public accounting. I mean, that's a lot different from going away for a weekend, right, like you were just talking about. And you were kind of out of the game for a significant amount of time, and then you had this re-entry period. And maybe talk about what that was like and how you got both reoriented toward the business world, making sure that you kept current on everything that was happening, because we know in public accounting, it's, you know, a continuous learning environment, and maybe what that adjustment was like for you coming back from, you know, full-time service back into being in the business world.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. You know, it was a significant transition, because when I was mobilized, I was working for a unit that was, we call a high-speed unit. They were always doing something. They made decisions very quickly. And I come back to the business world and things are a little bit slower paced. So, you know, and, you know, where we would make a decision in 2 days on certain things, you know, in the business world, sometimes it was like, I remember distinctly that they had talked about one issue for like 2 years because they were trying to figure out how much retention was. And I'm just like, really? You know, it's taken 2 years. I'm like, that to me was amazing, because, you know, here we're doing all this great stuff and we're just making decisions within maybe the same day, maybe in a couple of days that were, and that was a little different, because I had to slow down my tempo and think about, oh, okay, this is, you know, the tempo has changed. Coming back into public accounting, I would never suggest doing a 144A on your second week back on the job. I would say that was probably that was a very interesting experience. You know, I hadn't seen smog in a year, and I was like, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. So, you know, and trying to learn all that, I mean, it was a tough learning transition period, I'd say, for the first couple months, just because, you know, I was gone for all 15 months essentially, and I'm coming back in and things have changed. You know, we're maybe using the same system, but the programs have changed. And, you know, I can tell you kind of throw certain things out of your mind, because, you know, as one of my friends used to say, you can only have so many penguins on that iceberg. One has to fall off before another one comes on. I mean, there's kind of some truth to that, right? Because of your current situation. And so I sit there and I'm like, that to myself was probably a tough transition to get back. And plus, I think from a business world being moved, you know, I lost a certain amount of contacts that I had to regain. And so that was probably the toughest transition part. But at the same point, I would never change anything on that mobilization. I mean, it was a great mobilization. It pushed me a lot. And, you know, I look back at it now, I'm just amazed at what we got accomplished. And it was great. So I still talk to some of the people I know from that mobilization. And so, you know, watching them progress in their career, and, you know, we still chat about things. So, I mean, it's great, but at the same point, the negativity on that is, it is an interesting transition to get back to. So, yes, Bob.
When you were deployed, you still had to get your CPE, did you not, as a CPA?
So, all right, I'm gonna pick on not the Car House Society, but the licensure. But before I left, they made me get all my CPE in. And I'm like, I'm being deployed. Why do I need to get 40 hours? They're like, no, you need to get it done. And so when I came back, I had to make it up. And I'm like, this is stupid. I'm defending the country, right? I'm being mobilized under Title 10 orders. And you're telling me I have to get all my CPAs so I can maintain my license. So now I believe they've changed some of the rules, but yeah, I just had to knock it out. So
Mary Medley, can you respond to what Cliff said about he's working 24 hours a day when he's employed. How does the National Association expect people who've been reservists to or guards people to get their CPE when they're deployed?
Bob, that's a question for Rebecca.
Okay, she's on here, isn't she?
Oh, there you are. Put me on the spot, Bob. So actually, Bob, it's not the national organizations, it's a state board of accountancy. And the
yeah,
state board of accountancy is a regulatory agency and they have rules they have to follow. So unfortunately, those rules, there used to be a, you could write in for good cause, but they feel like if you're in military, even if you're in military service, you have access to the internet wherever you are, and you can get your CPE. So it's just how it is. And because it's regulatory and they can't change it. They can't make exceptions. I mean, they can make exceptions, but it's unusual for them to do so because they have to follow the rules.
Okay.
It's set by the state. These are you know what I'm saying? It's not like, oh, I've decided Cliff has to get a CPE.
yeah, I'm just picking on the state at this moment. So, I think there's a couple exemptions now, but I was like, really? So, but that's how I did it. I really just maintained it. And to be honest with everyone, I in my Navy career, I've only met 5 CPAs. And out of all the people I met, and it's funny because occasionally I'll run into someone and we'll figure out that we're CPAs because there's not that many. So, but that's the nice part about one thing I liked about being in the Navy Reserves is I don't do accounting. I do something completely different, which keeps me refreshed. I know some people who are police officers, they'll be into it. Their job is to be an MP or shore patrol. And I'm like, I don't think I want to do that. Switch from one job to another job. I think you get burnout from that. So.
Well, I would have to think just like the skills that you learn in the military have helped you in business. I think the skills that you learn in business had to be a tremendous asset to the military.
That is true. The one thing I'm good at is budgeting. So I'm able to work through the budget aspect. So, but I do have a funny, interesting story. When I first joined, I had an admiral asked me what I was doing, and I told him I was a CPA. He said, well, we don't need CPAs. And about 4 years ago, the Navy was trying to get SOX compliant. And so they put out and said, hey, we need CPAs who knew SOX. And I was kind of chuckling because this was at a national level. And I'm like, I wonder if I can find the admiral still. So because the Navy did need CPAs at that time.
So I raised my hand, Cliff and Bob and Jim, because I just did a quick look around on the Google. I knew that there had been some relaxation. Back, Cliff, when you asked for the exemption or the waiver, the board was way more strict. And a lot of it had to do with who was sitting around the board table, frankly.
Got it.
For exactly the reason that Rebecca mentioned, because it's like, well, you can get it on the internet. What's the problem, right? When, as Bob said, excuse me, but I'm in Afghanistan on my military service deployment. It's the rules in Colorado specifically allow the board the authority to accept as an EX-CEPT, the requirements for holders who cannot continue their education for health, military service, or other good cause. The problem, as Rebecca already alluded to, is that it depends on whether they decide it's good cause or not, because it's at their discretion. And I would imagine that if you asked for it today, it might go the same way or it might be different. However, your alternative, right, was to go
Yeah.
inactive with your CPA certificate status, and then you would start up again when you came back from your deployment. So who knows what they would say today, but yeah, Bob, I'm with you. It's like, wait a minute, bigger purpose here.
Well, that's good to know that maybe we've made a little bit of progress.
Yeah, a lot more in the last several years because there's been so much more activity
Right.
around military service.
Well, we are at time, so I just wanted to give one more opportunity if anyone had another question. And if not, thank you, Cliff. Thank you for everything you shared, all the lessons, the experiences that are very interesting, but incredibly useful and valuable to all of us. And thanks for your service to our country. It's been significant, and both your service and your sacrifice. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Jim. And I really appreciate being invited to come out and share my story. And, the one thing I'll say is that, I do believe we live in the greatest country in the world. And, and I'm proud to work with people on the Navy side who are willing to sacrifice their lives and to defend this country. And so there's nothing better for me than to work with those people. And it's been a great experience.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I can't even really follow that, but I do want to make sure as we're closing that I remind everyone of our next presentation, which will be December 21st. And we have Bruce Stallman. Bruce is the CFO of ARC Thrift Stores, and he's a CPA, but he's got a really interesting message on the importance of gratitude and the life journeys, the things that have happened in his family, and how gratitude has helped pull him as well as the rest of his family through. And it's a really, I've heard this presentation and it's pretty incredible. And as we get into the end of the year and the holidays, I think you get a lot out of it. So I hope that you will all come back and join us and bring a colleague with you. So thank you all again for being here. Cliff, thank you again for your time and your talents. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Jim.
So great. I love Semper Gumby.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah, I saved that on my notepad. That's
Yep.
my new favorite.
And Patriot Time and OODA Loop. It's like
Yeah.
nuggets for the day. It's great.
Yes, great nuggets.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
I can't, I have to claim that the Marine Corps is the one that taught me that one. So,
Gotta learn this stuff somewhere, right? Sometimes it pops into our heads as original thought, but with how long humans have been walking the planet, I suspect that there's some iteration of it over time.
That's right.
Right.
It's great. Thank you so much, Cliff. It was a real pleasure.
thank you. I appreciate it. All
Take
right.
care.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.